So welcome to our Light and Lighting theme webinar. It's absolutely wonderful to have you all here with us today. We have an amazing lineup of speakers. Many thanks to our speakers, one of which is in the room with us, and the rest of us are spread across the globe. So we really appreciate you all giving your time in different time zones, etc. So the reason for this workshop, next slide please, is the IED, so our institute, the Environmental Design and Engineering Institute, is in the Bartlett School of Environment, Engineering and Resources, and we have now been here for 60 years. So this activity, which started last year with 2 workshops, was designed to celebrate this. So we had some workshops last year. Quite a lot of you will have attended. We discussed a lot of your ideas. And then we've put these together in a book. Next slide, please. And the book will be launched on the 8th of October and contains all the ideas we discussed at the workshops. And if you want a copy, let me know, because there are some free copies being sent out to people. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Professor Glen Jeffery, who is the Professor of Neuroscience at UCL's Institute of Ophthalmology. Glen came to see us 2 years ago, summer 2023, came to see me and Peter, and since then we have had multiple research collaborations, teaching collaborations, and yeah, it's been fantastic. So we hope that you think his work is as interesting as we do. So I'll hand over now to Glen to talk a bit about the health effects of long wavelength red light and near infrared radiation. Thank you.
I'm Glen. I've worked on a number of things. I'm fundamentally a vision scientist. And I've shifted. I'm getting old, and as I'm getting old, I'm interested in the influence of aging and light. And what I'd like to talk about is how the influence of light over 2 billion years has driven evolution, and why architects and lighting engineers are messing that up at the moment. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about things that some of you are going to go, God, he's saying that again, and other people are going to go, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. So what I'd like to talk about is these things called mitochondria. They're the batteries in your cells. You've got vast numbers of them, you know, anywhere between 1 and 10,000 in each cell, and they make the petrol that runs the body. And the petrol is called ATP. Don't worry about what it stands for. And you make your own weight, body weight in ATP every day. Wow. The batteries are critical because when the batteries run down, that's when you get old. Also, when the batteries run down, you get macular degeneration, you get dementia, and you get Parkinson's disease, amongst other things. And the batteries regulate roughly how long you live. So regulating batteries is really important. But the thing about mitochondria that makes them interesting is that they respond to light. So let's just talk about them as batteries. Figure on the right in red dots shows you all the mitochondria in a cell. And the figure on the right, on the left, shows you what a mitochondria looks like. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so mitochondria can tell what the wavelength of light is, and they can respond to the wavelength of light. So in normal daylight, we have this spectrum that you all know. We've got this broad spectrum of light that goes from about 300 nanometers to about 2000 nanometers. We only see a little bit of it, and that's the colored bit in the middle. But red light, well beyond our visual range, increases the charge on the battery. So that means there's more ATP, and that improves your physiology, and it improves your health span. Blue light, and in this case we're talking about visual blue light, 400, 450, which now is very common in LEDs, and you also find it in tubes, reduces the charge on the battery. It reduces your health span. You live less long if you're an animal. I suspect the same is true of humans. And you have less motor control. Your muscles run down. You have trouble kicking your kicking yourself out of bed in the morning. So that balance between blue and red, which actually has a natural balance in sunlight that hasn't changed for billions of years, is now something that I want to talk about because it's shifted. Could I have the next slide, please? And so what's so special about long wavelength light? Well, it passes through your body. On the top here is a hand of my colleague, and that hand is over an 850 LED, and it passes straight through your hand. It passes through your clothing, as you can see from this selection of Marks and Spencer clothing. And at the top here on the left-hand side, we've got an image of light passing through the body. Sunlight is the blue curve, and the red line is the curve measuring the light coming out the subject's back. So it's passing through. Big difference in the scale because a lot of that red light is absorbed in the body. But we can photograph light passing through the body in longer wavelengths. Look at that peak. That peak on this one is around 800 nanometers, but that's just because our spectrometers weren't good enough to go further out. 2000 nanometers, it's passing through your body as well. And the light that we're getting is not only light from the sky. Picture of a tree here is not snow. Picture of that tree is reflections of infrared light. Plants don't get warm in sunlight. They don't get warm in sunlight because they reflect infrared light, and the amount of infrared light that they reflect has a physiological consequence. Next slide, please. Right, so let's go over kind of the problems as perhaps they relate to you. So for millions of years, with billions of years, life has developed under sunlight. Incandescent lights were very similar in their spectral output, but now we have LEDs. And so the phrase that's come out is we have infrared starvation, referred to as modern scurvy, because it's a disease from an absence, as scurvy was, because our LEDs generally do not produce long wavelength light. They produce what we need to see. And the problem is made worse also because we sit in very often environments where the windows reflect infrared light, they don't let it in. So starvation of infrared light. And you can see at the bottom on the left, the area of light that's been taken away from us after billions of years of evolution, really since the late 1990s. And what's replaced it on the right-hand side is the spectrum of an LED. And look, it's got that big, sharp, blue peak, and the big sharp blue peak, mitochondria see it and they respond badly to it. It reduces ATP, it reduces your amount of physiological energy. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens if we walk into the room and we reintroduce infrared light? Well, that's going on quite a lot now. The first thing that happens, I love this graph because it's horrendous. Don't pay any attention to the detail, but these are bloods from individuals either sitting under LEDs or given a burst of infrared light. And you can see the red, there's a completely different pattern. The red and the black peaks are different. You have things circulating in your blood that are very, very different depending on the light you're exposed to. In this case, it's cytokines. We find lots of others. So if you want to supplement someone with infrared light, I work on vision. You think I have to do it through my eyes? I don't. So a lot of guys working on Parkinson's disease now, which is a mitochondrial disease, are treating primates that they've induced Parkinson's disease in them. They're treating them by shining the light on different parts of their bodies. So in this case, they've been shining it on the feet or the abdomen, and they can improve the symptoms of early induced mitochondrial disease by 70%. So you don't have to see it. The mitochondria in your body respond to it, and they all start talking to one another via the blood. Next slide, please. We've done this in this study here. In this study, we exposed people to long wavelength light. We tested their vision. What is their threshold for detecting in vision? And we shone the light on people's backs. And to make sure they weren't seeing anything, we wrapped their heads in silver foil. So the light could only have an effect on the skin, but we were testing the eyes. just look on the right-hand side. The right-hand side, this is tritan. It's your detection of blue. It's always a bit dodgy. You really shouldn't see blue light in the way that we do. Your number of blue receptors is very, very low. Threshold is going down, is good. So when we shine the 850 nanometer light on people's backs, but we don't cover their eyes, we get a reduction in the threshold of 16%. When we do cover their eyes, we still get a reduction of 7%. That's significant. So your eyes and your body surface are reacting to the presence of light via your mitochondria, which then go off and signal to one another via your blood. The next one, please. And we can use this to tackle problems. The biggest consumer of energy biggest consumer of what you eat, sugars, are mitochondria. You get hot because your mitochondria are working. When you eat a croissant, your blood sugars peak, your mitochondria grab that, and they use that to make ATP. So we can control people's blood sugars with light. Don't know if you've ever done it. Glucose tolerance test, absolutely horrible. You find out who your friends are when you're needing subjects. You get people to drink a vast quantity of glucose. You give them a burst of red light just beforehand to get their mitochondria working, and then you keep pricking their finger, and you take blood samples, and you see what's happening to their blood sugars. Mitochondria also need oxygen, so you stick a tube up their nose, and you measure the amount of CO2 they produce. Green are your control group, red are your infrared group, in this case 670, and there's a clear difference. Your blood sugars do not peak in the same way. Now you can have super high blood sugars, that doesn't matter. What does matter is how your blood sugars peak. So getting your mitochondria to work hard, taking serum, they're taking sugars, carbohydrates out of your blood, and you're reducing the amount of blood sugars you've got. And this is for a normal person. We now have the same data for type 2 diabetics, and you consume more oxygen. You can see the CO2 go up. Could I have the next slide? Big issue is. So this is a map of diabetes in the world. It peaks in Saudi Arabia. It peaks in Kuwait. And the reason why it does is they never go into sunlight. They never get any infrared light. They live in a world where it's just too hot. You run from the car to the building. All your glass is infrared blocking. And to be honest, you have a pretty awful lifestyle. And that is a problem, so that we get a peak in population diabetics. And it's certainly the Saudis and the Kuwaitis are desperately interested in how they can regulate blood sugars with light. And Kuwait's just opened up this institute for diabetes that actually looks about the same size as Essex University. It's quite vast. They realise the costs in the long term that they're going to have to face. Next slide. We also have problems in other respects. So what happens if we live in a world where blue light is dominant? Let's take those blue lights that we get in LEDs and let's just expose people to them. In this case, we're talking about 420 nanometers or 450 nanometers. On the left-hand side, the graphs there, this is a whole group of people that are cannulated. It's a German experiment, and the blood is sampled at regular intervals. The shaded area is when someone turns on a blue light. I think it was 450 nanometers. Two things happen instantly. One is that there is an increase in your heart rate at the bottom, and at the top, there is a very marked drop in your blood pressure. So you walk into a room which is strongly illuminated with these wavelengths, and you have an instant physiological response that remains actually even after the lights turned off. Okay, that is really not good news. Another one where we can see how badly mitochondria are affected is a recent study published by NASA and super fit people up on the International Space Station, and they're being monitored every 2 to 3 hours, blood samples, etc. And they came back and there was this fantastic paper in Cell, which is a very high profile journal, which said there's something wrong with our astronauts. There's something wrong with the mitochondria in our astronauts. Well, you can see from the picture of this astronaut, he's in an environment which is totally saturated in short wavelength LEDs. They are particularly concerned about this because if you want to send people to Mars, which they want a commercial company to do, they're going to get prosecuted by the people when they come back. If we look at animal experiments where we expose them to 420 or 450, which is the bottom right-hand graph, what happens to mature animals that are put under those lights and they are just LED lights at those wavelengths? They instantly start getting fat. This is body weight of those animals that are put there, and they lose control of their blood sugars. And lastly, I told you, aging. Mitochondria regulate the pace of aging, and everybody in the aging community is looking at this picture because that was the lady who went up to space for 2 weeks and she ended up being there for months. And she came back looking like that. And mitochondria control aging. She's been in an environment where she's lost control of her mitochondria, and that is the consequence. And no one else is talking about it apart from all the people in aging research. I think that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you. We are going to the next presentation, which is dealing with how we are, as lighting designers, or how the buildings are being designed in terms of lighting and what kind of problems we have there. So we have Hillevi Hemphala, senior lecturer at Design Sciences, Division of Ergonomics and Aerosol Technology from Lund University. And she has her background or PhD on visual ergonomics, with bachelor in optometry. Her passion is to help people get a sustainable visual environment to minimize eye strain, headaches, and musculoskeletal strain. Hillevi has initiated a novel project on a visual ergonomic risk assessment method, VERAM, based on subjective ratings and objective risk assessment, a tool in evaluating the visual environment and helping workers to a better working life. She's currently working on the effect of flickering lights or temporal light modulation on the brain effect on brain in an fMRI, and she will be talking about characterizing visual needs. So it's completely another spectrum that we will be talking about. Thank you, Hillevi. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mandana, and thank you for having me here today. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about, but after the last presentation, I've been, yeah, that was really interesting. So thank you. As Mandana said, visual ergonomics and visual environment is my passion in how we're supposed to design that to get a good and sustainable working life. So the visual ergonomics is not just about lighting, it is about furniture, it's about all the things that we can see in the visual environment and how can we get that to function in the best possible way. But it also comes down to the visual ability and what are we supposed to do in regards to glasses and spectacles and what type of lenses are we supposed to have. So that is also part of my field of research. So when looking into the visual ergonomics and visual environment, so having lighting placed behind you causes a lot of issues with regards to reflections and things in the reading material, but also shadows at the reading area. And And if you're supposed to sort of have your computer screen, like the picture here in the middle, you can see that this lady here, she has a computer sitting right by the window. And so many people love this placements because I can look out. But the problem here is that our eyes will adapt to the brightness of the sky out here. And sometimes this could be 100 times brighter than the computer screen that she's trying to look at. So just by taking the blinds down like half the window to this area here, that will sort of increase the visibility on the screen because she will be light adapted to a much better circumstance. And also if you have, I think that all of you guys have been sitting down by the kitchen table trying to read a glossy magazine. What happens? Well, you have all of these reflexes in the magazine because the lighting is in front of you. So here is a person that's supposed to sit here, and the lighting comes in front of you and causes you both direct glare from the luminaire itself, but also these reflections in the reading material. So the lighting is not supposed to be behind you or in front of you. You're supposed to have it directly above you, but not as far back so that you can't see the luminaire itself. Okay, so what is good lighting? And what I usually struggle with is that there's a lack of reference of what good lighting actually is. If I ask people, what is good lighting? They don't have an answer because they lack a frame of reference of what good lighting actually is. And that, I think, is the hardest part with getting people to understand why they should invest in better lighting due to this issue. And also, why lighting is important and how light affects us, because if you don't have a frame of reference of what good lighting is, you will not even consider asking about how lighting will affect us. And that is the thing that I think is the most hardest thing for us to get the sort of decision makers to actually make decisions in investing in good lighting. Because if they do that, we can get so much better than what we actually have here. So this is a workplace that I came out to, and they have put up cardboard in front of the LED panel in the ceiling. And that is just so classic. When you come out to workplace, they put up cardboard or black plastic bags in the windows or covering the things so they can actually work. And fortunately, we could do a lighting intervention in this facility so that it actually improved for those individuals. But what we also struggle with is sensitivity to visual stimuli that I saw Arnold is participating here as well. He's been talking about this quite a bit. And this a colleague came in to me and she said like, oh, I've put up my favorite fabric behind my computer screen. But since then I got loads of headaches. And I was like, oh, but this is a really harsh stimuli for the brain to process. So even though if I can see it and if I like it, it's still hard for me to look at. So about a third of us are much more sensitive to visual stimuli, and different studies say different amounts. So about a third of us. It might be even half of us. And that means that we can get headaches, migraines, eye strain, and also an increasement in flicker sensitivity among these individuals that are more sensitive to visual stimuli. So glare, do you experience glare right now? And what I usually recommend people to do is use the hat test. This is what I call the hat test. So if you just hold your hands up like that, if that's more comfortable, then you're exposed to glare. And that's one way to start questioning the visual environment. What is good? What is not good? Okay, if I put my hands up, oh yeah, that light source up there is really bothering me. What can I do to remove it? So the hat test, I think, is the best way to start questioning the lighting in a good way. So we did this glare intervention study going from LED panels like that you can see up here to these pendant luminaires that was placed straight above at the front part of each desk. So we went from a luminance ratio over here in the ceiling of 1 to 50 down to 1 to 4. So it was so much better, so much less glare, and no glare from the luminaire down either. So, but the thing was, in this situation, it actually became a psychosocial conflict between the co-workers. So it was so infected that the union had to be involved in trying to figure this out. So this is why we came in and tried to do something about this. So, and we did manage to get a significant reduction of the eye strain. We also had a reduction of headaches and migraines, as well as neck pain, but unfortunately not significant. But the best thing was the conflict ended. So all of a sudden, people could actually have their luminaires on instead of having a fight of, don't turn the lighting on. Oh, I have to turn the lighting on. So this was a really big thing for this company. And it was a newly done, remodeled open plan office. And unfortunately, it didn't work. So these LED panels is what I think is really glary and should not be anywhere where we're actually doing visually demanding work of any type or any kind whatsoever. So, and we've also developed this, like Mandana said, visual ergonomics risk assessment method that we named VERAM. So VERAM is an online method. We even have an app that consists of two different parts. So it's one subjective part with a questionnaire about different strain, like eye strain, headache, migraines, but also muscle pain and muscle strain. And after that, we go over to the objective part. So we do have an education in visual in VERAM. And with this, you can actually get to know the method. And so you do have different light measurements in there, but also an assessment sort of checklist. So we do have these red, green, and yellow. So you can have a red risk for glare or a green risk for glare that is no risk. So we have all of these different parts that you can sort of do this. But you can, if you're more interested, you can read more about our VERAM method at veramlight.com. And with VERAM, we also managed to actually look into, and we discovered that those individuals that actually report eye strain and have a high amount of eye strain, about 95% of them reported some sort of musculoskeletal strain from the upper part of the body, mostly neck pain and shoulder pain. And so we did do an statistical analysis of this, and there's a direct connection, a correlation between eye strain and musculoskeletal strain from the upper part of the body. Even the arm strain was actually increased. So here is a lot of things here that we notice that there is a direct connection between the eye and the body. And if we have glare in our visual field, of course, we can develop neck pain. So we can actually get sickly due to neck pain just because we have a wrongly placed luminaire that causes glare. So we can see these directions all the time. So as Mandana said as well, we've been into these with TLM and flickering lights. So usually TLM, or that part of TLM that is non-visual, we can actually see as well that we can get migraines and headaches, eye strains such as photosensitivity, stress. It affects our alpha activity of the brain. And it's harder for individuals with dyslexia to read. It affects reading speed and reading comprehension. And neurodiverse individuals might be more sensitive. It seems like there's a connection here. So this is an area that really needs to be more investigated. And the image that you can see here to the right is actually my son when he was born 14 years ago. And one ADHD researcher that I spoke to claimed that most of like 70% of ADHD kids was actually premature when I spoke to him like 10 years ago. And most of them have been in this blue environment, sunbathing due to the jaundice. And most of these luminaires were actually flickering. So this could be, it could contribute to the severeness of ADHD. It does not cause it, but it could contribute to the severeness of this. And you can actually see here the stripe pattern is actually that it's got a temporal light modulation. And you can even do this with your phone. If you just take a photo at a near distance, you can actually see these stripe patterns. And that could actually be the reason behind migraines and other things. So this is why we wanted to look into this migraine. So we did do a huge fMRI study. It's my colleague Johannes Lindén that is laying here going into the fMRI scanner in our flicker study. And these are very preliminary results from our study. And we can actually see that part of this is for the migraineurs, and then we have healthy subjects, and then we compare them to the migraineurs. And we now know that healthy subjects will have an effect, especially in the visual. So the healthy subject, it's the red part here, that is affected by both visual and non-visual flicker. But then we do have other parts here with the migraineurs, and the migraineurs, they have we're writing the paper now, so I can't really share any images, but we could actually say that the migraineurs had an increased blood flow in a part of the brain that's called the periaqueductal gray. And in this area, it's actually called the pain center of the brain. And with an increased blood flow there, it could actually prove that non-visual flicker, or TLM, is actually causing migraines. So this is something that we just discovered, and we're very, very fortunate that we managed to find this in the study. So we're very happy. But it is really, really bad because there are no standards regarding this with the LEDs, especially for the cognitive functions of us. There are no standards, no recommendations, no nothing. It's only for the visual spectrum. And since all of this is non-visual, we need to do something about this. And I wanted to end with saying something about, if you're doing some sort of study with participants, I think that it's really, really important that you know something about their visual ability. So you need to measure the visual acuity, but also the contrast visual acuity, because there are some parts here that could actually affect your ability. And when you're assessing or even rating the visual environment, you need to make sure what it is you're dealing with. But also color vision, we don't know how important that is. But the main thing here is with a stereo vision test. So you need to make sure that they're using both eyes at the same time. And you can do this with the help of a TNO test. And it takes like 2 minutes to perform. So it's not something that is time consuming whatsoever. And it's just these type of Pac-Man figures that is hiding in these red different blocks. So you just need to put on a pair of spectacles and then look at these and say what way the mouth is facing on this Pac-Man figure here. And that's about it. And I can just say that as a small comment, because in our flicker study that we did, in the fMRI study, we are actually about 10% of our participants were excluded due to this. So it's not just one or very few, it is 10%. And how will those 10% affect our results in the other end? So I think this is really interesting. So the takeaway, requirements of visual ability and visual needs. We need to have enough lights to see our work task, but light sensitive individuals need less. They don't need as much as other individuals. We need to have it glare free. So try out with the hat test, and also free from flicker or TLM, and use your phones to detect any type of flicker by taking a picture of a really close distance. So that was it. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so a wonderful thank you, Hillevi. That was, I learned a lot during that, and I think it's particularly pertinent now with LEDs being used in domestic environments. I've noticed when they reach the end of their life, they tend to flicker like mad, and that can obviously have a negative effect on lots of us. So next up, we have Jennifer Veitch. So Jennifer is the president of the CIE. She is Principal Research Officer at the National Research Council of Canada. I first met Jennifer in 2012 at Steve Fotis's LumenNet conference in Sheffield, and her feedback to everyone was very much based around preserving the integrity of science, having, testable hypotheses, considering threats to external validity when drawing conclusions from our work. So yeah, really inspiring. She has an environmental psychology background, and I will let her talk to us now about lighting and design decisions, research gaps to move the needle. Thank you for that.
Okay, so thank you for this opportunity, and I'm going to apologize now because I have a very packed morning, so I'll be here until the top of the hour, and then I'm going to miss all the great discussion later. And I only caught the last few minutes of Hillevi's presentation, which was really cool, and I can hardly wait to read the paper on the fMRI work. So I'm maybe going to talk about something a little bit different, a little more general, but how we get from all the great research that we all do to maybe actually seeing some of it put into application. This question was sent to me. I gather there was an organizing meeting that I wasn't part of. And so I thought, okay, how do I adjust what I was going to say to address this question? So the question is, what currently drives lighting and design decisions, and how can we shift that towards well-being? So I illustrating this by what I hope we all have as a goal, which is overall better lighting quality. Keeping in mind, of course, that for the most part, of course, there are now these days, lighting designs that are more focused on greenhouses and horticulture and aquaculture and all those things. But for the most part, most of us are concerned with lighting for people and maintaining their well-being. But that also happens in the context of some kind of architectural setting. Even if it's outside, it could be considered architectural. And we have economic and environmental realities that always play a role in any particular, installation or design. So we have to balance all those things to come out with a good quality solution. Well, how do we make those decisions? Well, I wasn't actually given direction as to whether I should be paying more attention to commercial buildings or residential buildings. But obviously, a lighting decision starts from what's the building type, what's the place I'm trying to light. And that's also going to influence another big category of I'll say constraints on some decisions, which is the regulatory requirements. They'll differ depending on where you are, which authorities have jurisdiction. There are almost certainly going to be some form of energy regulations. There will certainly be some kind of building regulation. If it's a workplace, there's probably some labor regulations that also influence what you must do. And any of those might or might not reference the standards and the recommendations that many of us are active in trying to develop. And that's really where one of the limitations is, because to have things have teeth, they need to be referenced in legislation, but legislation tends to only reference and use things that create a kind of lowest common denominator. And I can see Peter Boyce on this call, and I love some of the things that he said in the past about how we've done a really good job of eliminating the truly bad lighting, and that's what these regulations do. We haven't necessarily done a great job of motivating people to go to the better lighting, the really good high quality lighting. That does come in part with the optional certifications that people might adopt. They might seek WELL certification for their building. They might seek a LEED or other energy and environment kind of certification for their building. Some of those have points requirements or points giving criteria that are quite good and that could move the needle towards a better or a more well-being focused way of doing things. Problem with that is that A, they're optional, and B, some of the things they recommend are not necessarily the things that a lighting expert would like to see in those requirements. So pros and cons. Organizational structure is another influence, and I've highlighted a particular publication of mine here for this. This, of course, is only referenced for commercial buildings, doesn't apply to homes. But in a commercial building, one of the problems is that often the decision makers with respect to buildings decisions are not the decision makers who pay the consequence of the lower well-being. So if I'm a facilities manager, I may have a fixed budget to deliver the space or to, a construction budget for new capital investment. But that's my budget. And if I make choices that are later going to harm the people in the building, I'm not going to pay any price for that. The organization will, but that's not going to come out of me. I may get credit for building on time and on budget. And so I think I've done a great job. And no one's ever drawing the connection between that and the sick leave that happens among the people in the building later. So there's a real problem in our connections, the way organizations make decisions, and we need to be talking to people at a higher level than just the building designer people or the facility manager people. Market availability also is an influence. You can't put in place something that doesn't exist or that's too expensive. And then sadly, I think at the lowest possible part of this heap is good evidence. Now that's unfortunate, and that's why I've cited this other paper, which was a review that Guy Newsham and I did some years ago, in which we looked at the kinds of things that organizations might do and how do they stack up. There's a lot of corporate strategies that are not building strategies that are undertaken with not actually terribly much evidence that work. But when you do look for the evidence, you find that in fact, investments in buildings pay back at least as well, and in many cases better than those corporate strategies. So that's part of the information that we need to get fed up or delivered up, I should say, to these higher levels of organizations. So it's a complicated problem, is what I'm trying to say here. Now, we do have some pretty good evidence from a consensus document on how to light for well-being, but it's not perfect, and I'm going to talk about why. So I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with the Brown et al. Recommendations for a minimum of 250 lux melanopic equivalent daylight illuminance at the eye during the day, down to 10 lux maximum in the evening, and less than 1 lux overnight. So that's good evidence. There's other evidence out there for other issues related to well-being. I'm going to selfishly highlight a report that I was part of writing, which was published last fall for the IEA 4E Smart Sustainability and Lighting and Controls platform. And you can get that report online, and you can see all the different chapters there, including, of course, one on temporal light modulation, which now I don't need to talk about because Hillevi's done that so well. So there's all kinds of suggestions in that report about the research needs that would lead us to be able to do lighting for better well-being beyond merely lighting the task, or even beyond providing the aesthetic pleasure in the appearance of the space. I'm not going to talk about any of that right now. What I am going to talk about is that in order to move the needle on better lighting for well-being, we need to grapple with the fact that that recommendation, in particular for the 250 lux melanopic EDI during the day, is way higher than anything that's allowed under the energy regimes in most countries. In fact, there's an interesting paper just published 10 days or so ago from Barbara Matusiak's lab in Norway, which said, under some of the assumptions they made, to try to deliver that using electric lighting would require a 300% increase in lighting energy use, which for most places is just not possible. But, if you use good daylighting, you can end up with only a small increase, about 5%, they calculated under their particular constraints. Now, you can model that in different climates, in different places, different building types. No doubt the exact numbers will differ. But I think the reality is that if we're going to get traction on delivering that kind of high light dose during the day, we need to be able to do daylighting a lot better, and we need to use controls a lot better. Because, of course, we all know that higher amount of daylighting comes at a risk of causing a glare problem, causing overheating in buildings. Don't want that. We don't want to increase the energy use associated with cooling either, says the person who's in a very well air-conditioned building in a place where it's been 34 degrees for 3 days. So we need to grapple with that, and we need that kind of integrative work between the design and engineering communities and the lighting community that allows us to make good use of controls, good use of advanced glazing systems, coarse sunlighting, any way to make better use of daylight into buildings so we can get that free light, energy free more or less, in order to increase that daily light dose and have other benefits that are associated with windows that I assume Lisa's probably going to talk about when it's her turn. The other gap, I think, in moving the needle to getting to more application is to engage with people who do health economics research. So this is a completely other specialty. I don't know of anybody in the lighting world who has the exact qualifications to do this kind of work. But I think we need to be able to document the societal consequences of poor quality lighting in a way that policymakers will pay attention to. there are some good epidemiological studies out there. I've highlighted 2 here using the UK Biobank data. But that's just one step. On its own, this evidence of mortality risk and the psychiatric disorders and other related studies isn't quite enough, because you need to take that additional step that converts these kinds of outcomes to the cost to a healthcare system or the cost to an economy of the reduced time at work that people with psychiatric orders are able to give. Now, anybody who's listened to me for the last 30 years says, what's happened to you, Jennifer? Suddenly you're talking about the dreaded productivity word. And to some degree I am, but I want to be very clear that I am not talking about individual level productivity in the sense of how many words can you type. I'm talking about it at a societal or a macro level that we have engaged in. And this is something I've only recently become really aware of, because I have colleagues who study radon, which is a colorless, odorless, radioactive gas that's released from underground in many parts of the world. And it's the second leading cause of death from lung cancer, only after smoking. In some countries where smoking is on the decline, it's now becoming the leading cause of lung cancer. And my colleague has been telling me that it's been very difficult to get radon mitigation measures put into our building code in Canada because people haven't been processing thoroughly the economic costs of the death associated with that lung cancer risk and the healthcare costs of treating people with lung cancer. And that seems to me like that's such an obvious thing to do. That's such a hit you between the eyes, obvious risk. If it's difficult to get that into a regulatory system, then boy, we have a hard uphill road to climb with lighting research. So I think we really need to be engaging with some of these people and understanding how they think and how they influence policymakers in order to really move the needle on lighting, better lighting for well-being. There are, of course, a lot of avenues for influence. You're probably familiar with most of these. You may be active in many of these. Of course, rah-rah CIE. I hope you're active in CIE technical committees or in your local or national standards bodies, doing what you can to influence market access in your whatever your national or regional place is. But I also want to highlight the importance of influencing the general public. And this is one that we haven't really done terribly well with respect to lighting, but I am seeing signs that there's an increased amount of sort of chatter about that. So just yesterday in a national newspaper in Canada, there was an excellent article by a sleep researcher about how to plan for jet lag during summer travels, but most of her recommendations had to do with light and lighting. And so there's kind of a growing awareness of how this is influencing us, but we're not fully using all the tools available to us to get that word out. And the reason I think that's important is that when the general public is engaged in a topic, then they also go back to their legislators and to their employers, and they're able to start to advocate for change. So we need to use that medium to try to get the word out so that it's not just a few thousand people who care about lighting in the world who are promoting better lighting, it's everybody in the public. And to that end, I want to put in a bit of a plug for an initiative that several organizations, including the CIE, have been working on in the last year or so, which was just launched last month, the Light for Public Health initiative, in which we have taken the current consensus on lighting for well-being, we've condensed it into 26 validated statements, and we have simple versions of those statements that can be used for public messaging. And we're developing some additional infographics and other media that people can use to try to promote this work in their nationality, in their general region, and so forth, because we think that that's one of the ways that we're going to get that work out. So we need the whole sort of pattern from really good research, and there's lots of guidance out there about what needs to be done, through to influence in whichever of your favorite national acronym or international acronym you want to become involved in, and influencing the public in order to make change. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was right on the spot, as you could say. And I think one of the things that you basically were talking about was about the daylighting aspects of things, which came, and this is sort of leading us to the next presentation that we have related to daylighting challenges in 21st century by Lisa Heschong. So Lisa is an architecture researcher, an MIT trained and licensed architect with training also in ecology, with over 30 years of experience. Her career has been defined by a deep commitment to understanding the energy performance of buildings, with a particular emphasis on lighting and daylighting. In recent years, her work has expanded to explore how building influence human health and biology. Lisa was the founding principal of Heschong Group, a pioneering consultancy known for advancing the science of daylighting. Lisa is also a fellow of Illuminating Engineering Society, reflecting her influential contributions to the field. She is the author of 2 pivotal and inspiring books, Thermal Delight in Architecture, MIT Press 1979, and Visual Delight in Architecture, Routledge 2021. So the first one is exploring how thermal comfort qualities can be used in architectural design, and the second one is looking into natural daylight and view. Both of them very inspiring, and I've known Lisa also, and many of the people today since long, and it has been always inspiring to listen to her. So looking forward to what Lisa has to tell us about the daylighting research.
So thank you for the introduction, Mandana, and lovely to be with you all, old friends and new friends today. Let me go back. What I want to talk about is really where I see the research relative to daylight going. And to set that into context, I've been using this slide for a number of talks that I give to graduate research seminars, specifically in building science, which is sort of what I consider my field to be. And looking at how it has been evolving over time. So when I was in graduate school, my professors, who had all been trained 20 or 30 years earlier, were expert in what I would call building physics and measuring physical processes within buildings. We were taught to use measurement tools for light, for heat flow, to understand microclimatology. So we were studying the physical world with physical tools. But then as my career got launched, it really began to ride the wave of computer modeling. So computers, the architecture lab at MIT was getting started. We were delving into how much we could do. And that progress has been dramatic over the course of my career, to the point where we now have exceptional computer tools that can handle multiple inputs simultaneously at a very fine level, moving into virtual reality, artificial reality, or even AI. And so there's been an enormous amount of attention at developing these tools and finding out what we can learn from them. But I would like to argue that the next wave, as we would say in surfing land, is, as Glen Jeffries was talking this morning, that basically we need to understand the biology of light. And we see this bubbling up, as Jennifer mentioned. The recent UK Biobank studies looking at epidemiology are having a profound effect. Understanding human behavior and how humans are reacting and managing this world, but even drilling into the microbiology, nanoscale, even DNA, is where we are going to be doing the most learning and where there is going to be the most innovative pressures for change in our environments. So this is sort of my thesis. I'm going to try to elaborate it briefly. And I agree absolutely with Jennifer that bringing the public health establishment into the world of lighting is sort of one of our next mandates. I've been spending an enormous amount of time reading public health literature over the last couple of years, and it's both astonishing and discouraging how little they know about light, how poorly they measure it. So there's huge room for improvement with collaboration to help them get a better handle on how to measure it. There's initiatives being developed to help create better methodologies on that front. So I wanted then to take this idea of a progression from physical measurements to simulation to biological impacts and look at it more specifically how it applies in the field of lighting. So as I said, in past 50 years, we've had static analysis looking primarily at comfort and satisfaction as an outcome, primarily looking at illumination levels. But more recently, within the last 20 years, we've moved into much more dynamic analysis, looking at yearly typical meteorological year TMY analysis and our computer analysis, looking at how chronobiology affects individual health outcomes and the neuroscience of that, which leads us to the present of what are we doing now? And what I see is that we are moving into mastering microsensors, which are creating these massive data sets, along with the data sets that come from epidemiology, looking at population level studies and lifetime outcomes rather than individual clinical outcomes, and multiple operable systems simultaneously that have interactive effects that we can study with these big data models. But what does the future present? And I would argue that in terms of getting ready for the future, what would a research group like UCL really want to be looking at? And I think there's very strong evidence, as I will try to show, and as Glen Jeffries has already spoken about, that we need to expand our definition of light from the visible spectrum to the solar spectrum, which means including up through ultraviolet and down through near infrared, maybe even far infrared light, looking not just at individual measurements, but potentially rates of change over the course of dawn dusk, the types of dynamics that are experienced in our evolutionary background. We're certainly going to have to look at planetary climatic impacts, looking at climate adaptation. There are lots of challenges ahead in terms of how to manage both our urban environments and our buildings under those new stresses, and how daylighting fits into that equation, whereas right now it's not being talked about within that world of carbon reduction or energy policy. So we need to get back into that conversation. And then fundamentally, on the biological level, what we're seeing is a move now into the fundamental mechanisms, as Glen Jeffries was talking about, in terms of how exposure to different wavelengths may affect specific cellular processes. I spend a lot of time worrying specifically about developmental issues, how exposure to light as infants and as children may affect our development, including myopia. And there's a new frontier people are starting to talk about in terms of quantum biology, where we're seeing that photons are actually being used as a communication system within the body. And that is really far out there, but is very provocative. So that's sort of a very large scale framework of where I see research needing to go and research groups needing to prepare for. Now, taking a step back to my much simpler life as an architect, when I was in school, we were taught that windows were one of the most complex components of a building because they needed to do so many things. They're providing security, they're providing weather protection. I spent a career studying the heat flows of windows, solar gain and heat loss. Certainly windows feed into indoor air quality and filtration. Communication and emergency egress, how they fit into safety measures in buildings, and then certainly privacy versus transparency. But the focus here really is in terms of light, daylight, availability, modulation, and I'm going to particularly focus on view, which has been another subject that I've been exploring in more depth recently. And over again, in my studies and others, we see that people are passionately devoted to their views. They have an emotional connection with it. They resist enormously having their views removed or taken away from them. So what is the magic of this? And I would argue that there are a number of conscious awareness issues with views. People will tell you when you survey them what they like. They like being aware of what's happening with the weather. They like being able to watch people and animals outside. They like the reassurance that nothing bad is happening outside. They can sort of retreat into a calmer world by having this surveillance that has been suggested. But there's also a number of unconscious processes that we can measure, but that will not be reported, self-reported by people. I have argued that views enable daydreaming, and that there is a continuous rhythm of cognitive processing that moves back and forth between outward perception versus inward perception. And people, when they're looking out windows, tend to set back into what's called the default mode of mental processing, paying more attention to their inward processes. Also, sort of body awareness. We have a lot of suggestions that people who have window views actually are more active, exercise more often. That seems puzzling, but there's an activation component that seems to be involved there. Certainly circadian stimulus, and I'll give you some sense of that, how that plays in. And there may be many other physiological stimulus coming from windows that I don't have time to go into. But let's just sort of drill into the circadian piece first. Here on the bottom left, we've got a chart showing the spectrum of the sun outside of the atmosphere. That's the dotted black line. The sun radiation at sea level is the thin blue line, and diffuse sky radiation without the sun component is the thick blue line at the bottom. But you can see all three of these peak at 480 nanometers, which is presumably not a coincidence because it is also the peak sensitivity of the IPRGC melatonin function. So that basically the IPRGC in the back of the retina are looking for blue sky, looking for that stimulus that the sun is out to help regulate the circadian rhythm. And I would argue that looking out a window is one of the strongest circadian stimuli that we get inside of buildings. So Jennifer was talking about the Brown and Company recommendation of 250 melanopic lux. That is at an ambient measurement, or that's how that's usually applied. But if one looks out a window, the amount of that radiation coming into the eye is at an order or two magnitude greater, so 10 to 100 times more than the ambient illumination in the space. Therefore, simply glancing out a window gives you what I like to call a circadian snack, gives you a little boost. And that may be one of the reasons people are so attached to their windows. I was noticing that in Hillevi's glare presentation, she was altering the condition of the electric lighting, but the windows seem to be left untouched. And that certainly is also another important part of the visual environment that tends to get left out of analysis. The question is, how much do people actually look out of windows? And we don't have very much evidence, but there's one good study that was done by Mandana at EPFL, looking at where people are looking within a room. This was sort of a shoebox study room with a window off to the left side of the study subjects who are working at a computer. And they were given three different types of tasks. One was a set of instructions on a computer. They then had a minute or two to think about it. They had a minute or two to answer the questions, and then they had a minute or two to interact and evaluate that process. Or they were given the instructions on a phone and responded verbally, or they were given the instructions on paper and responded back on paper. And then they, during all four of these processes, input, thinking, output, interaction, they collected data about where people were looking within the room. And a simple assessment that I pulled out of the data was that about 40% of the task time, they were looking out the window. But most often in that spare thinking time, when they needed to process the information and consider what their response was going to be, they tended to look out the window about 80% of the time while they were developing these ideas. And again, what I've also observed is that you can't collect this data from self-reports. People are very unconscious about what they're looking at while they're thinking. It's very difficult to collect, but direct observations could give us more information. The net summation here is that people are looking out windows a lot more than we think they are. Another piece of the equation here is, in the last 20 years, we have really developed an enormous amount of understanding about the melanopsin process driving circadian rhythms in the body. And that is now well understood science. But at the cusp, it turns out researchers have now identified not just one, but up to 6 different types of IPRGC that are controlling melatonin production. So they're now called M1 through M6. And then those sensors have been found to connect directly with at least 17 different brain regions in addition to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. the point being is there's a lot more going on than just circadian stimulus. And we're just beginning to understand all of these connections on how melatonin is connecting directly with different brain processes. But even further, we are now looking at 2 additional new opsins in addition to melanopsin, non-visual opsins. These are called opsin 3 encephalopsin and opsin 5 neuropsin, which have been found both in the retina, as are the melatonin, but also in various parts of the brain, skin, and other organs. It's being hypothesized that the stimulus of these new opsins are implicated in eye growth and development in young children, in metabolic regulation, in temperature control, and many other physiological processes. So this is really laying out the foundation for a whole new biology of light, which is just beginning to develop and will soon be coming to a research institute near you. Here we have the peak sensitivities of these different opsins. Opsin 1 are the cones. Opsin 4 is melanopsin. And we can see that opsin 3 has moved further into the short wavelength blue light, and opsin 5, neuropsin, is at the far end of violet light on into the ultraviolet A region. So if we're going to really understand how these radiation sources are affecting health, we need to measure them. Currently, most of our spectrometers don't go that far into the ultraviolet. Ultraviolet A has not particularly been considered a problem, so people are usually either studying ultraviolet B or they're studying the visible spectrum, not that missing piece in between. So we need to start collecting that data, paying attention to it. And at the same time, I would argue, per Glen Jeffries, that there's a similar revolution going on with understanding what's happening with near infrared. And we need to expand our criteria into that dimension also. So this is really sort of step 1 of understanding more of what is happening. Now, back to architecture, what really keeps me up at night is what we have been doing with Windows, which Glen Jeffries just touched upon. As I was saying, my career began at MIT as low-E coatings were being developed, literally in the lab next door to where I was working. And the first generation of near infrared of low-E coatings were focused really on reducing near and far infrared radiation. So this graph is showing you the black line at the top is clear glass, clear untreated glass, standard sodium glass. The blue and the purple lines were the first generation of low-E coatings that were primarily targeting near and far infrared reductions. But since then, we have second and third generation low-E coatings, green to orange to red, that have progressively narrowed further and further on the visible spectrum and cutting out substantially the near infrared. But we're going to also zoom in on the shortwave end of the spectrum and expand that out and look at how this interacts with those newly discovered opsins that are affecting human health, opsin 5. You can see that from clear glass down to the latest, most stringent low-E glazing, there's an order of magnitude reduction in the spectrum that would be most prominently affecting opsin 5, opsin 3, not quite as much, but still fairly dramatic, a reduction on the order of 50%. And so we have, within a short period of time, dramatically changed the spectral transmission properties of windows, but we now have evidence that this may be impacting our health. And I think this is a fairly urgent task for studying, especially given climate change and concerns about carbon, the regulations are all pushing for ever more stringent glazing performance. There are other ways to reduce heat gain and heat loss through windows. It doesn't all have to be done with lowy windows. There are many other techniques. And finally, I want to end with a study that I did in conjunction with Cincinnati Children's Medical Center and Hospital, who have been researching opsin 5, especially relative to children's eye development, retinopathy, pathology of retinopathy plus myopia. And what we took was a very simple, standard portable classroom in San Francisco that was being successfully operated by the teacher as a daylit classroom, and wanted to understand what the stimulus was from different window treatments and lighting treatments in this classroom environment. So Malika Niasi put together a LARC simulation of this classroom, which produced these fisheye false color images of what the stimulus looks like for the different physiological responses. So the first image on the left is a visualization in basically black and white of that computer simulation. The next one is translating for photopic units, so as measured in lux. The next one is looking at melanopic units, similar to melanopic equivalent daylight illumination. How much stimulus is going to the melanopic IPRGC? Oops, you'll have to wait on that. And then the final one on the right is the stimulus of opsin 5, or the neuropic units. And then I've added this next line where we did, the first line is clear double glass untreated. So just 2 layers of 3mm glass. The second line is 2 layers of 3mm glass, but slightly tinted with current low E coatings on it. And you can see here how there's a slight reduction in visible transmittance due to the tinting, but there's a dramatic reduction in the opsin 5 transmission by the time we've just gone to the far end of the short wavelength spectrum. We did it one more time looking at just electric lighting using state-of-the-art LEDs in this classroom, designed to provide 500 lux at the students' tables. So this is considered to be high-level current state-of-the-art lighting for classrooms in California. And you can see that there's actually more visible light being produced by the LEDs, but substantially less melanopic and neuropic units. And then when we look at the comparison for this, you can see that it has the, I can't move things out of the way, but I believe that the electric lighting only goes down to about 6% of what was originally produced for the photopic. So there are dramatic shifts that are going on that we need to start paying attention to. We have the computer tools to do it, but we don't have the public health data to support it. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and let the discussion begin.
Thank you, Lisa.
Interesting.
Yeah, let the discussion begin. So from the audience, we will like to know your thoughts.
So does anyone want to kick off with a question? I have one. So should non-visual not really be called non-visual because it's likely to have a visual element to it? I wonder if this phrase of non-visual is a little bit outdated.
I think it is.
I remember a committee discussion about this about 10 years ago,
So why are we
discussing a ISO standard, and the term non-uniforming was used instead.
Yeah.
Currently, integrative lighting is the term that the CIE
I have no idea what that's supposed to
It
mean.
means, well, I think it means it's an overall term that avoids the pitfalls of saying, of defining light in terms of vision or not, or image forming. So it's a sort of, I think it's probably a sort of stepping stone term, perhaps, to a more inclusive definition of light that impacts biology beyond vision. So I think, I mean, obviously the CIE has its own processes for coming to these definitions, but I think it's to avoid the excluding things. It is quite hard to use it in lighting, integrative lighting, because you feel you always have to define what it's saying. But
Well, let me offer 2 additional or maybe 3 additional terms to think about. One is physiological effects of light, which become all inclusive. Another that is being used among the biologists for option 5 and option 3 are non-ocular receptors or non-ocular effects, meaning that they are being sensed and transmitted outside of the retina. So there's a number of levels, and you're certainly right that there's very good evidence that the IPRGC are interacting with the rods and cones and helping sensitivity under different situations. So one of the things that I've learned from biology is nothing is ever simple. and creating these dichotomies of this versus that hardly ever holds up, because things interact. There's secondary and tertiary systems. There's backup systems that when this one fails, there's another one that can become stronger and start having a bigger effect. We tend to have a very engineering mindset about vision, that it should work the way our engineered cameras or light bulbs work, but biology is very complex. And
just one other thought. I mean, light has got a long history. I think to try and qualify it into different types of light is a mistake. What we have to think about is radiation. You know, when you're talking about effects on mitochondria or effects on skin or something of that sort, it's radiation. You know, a radiation that falls on these IPRGC things. Yeah. Once you've got that, so I'd have thought that radiation, and then you can qualify that, because you always have to qualify it anyway. Yeah. So if you have radiation for non-vision, well, effectively you've got vision, which involves light, and then you've got everything else. And what we're looking at is the effects of radiation on, you know, ultraviolet, infrared, near infrared, and the effects are at all different, very different levels. Some of them are in the eye, some of them are in the skin, some of them are basically simply cellular processes. So I think radiation would be a simple term to bear in mind and separate vision from all the other bits that we're now interested in.
Yeah, as a vision scientist, I'm very happy for the word vision to be taken out of it.
Okay.
So you know, and non-image forming doesn't kind of fit very well with me because I use Ganzfeld poles quite a lot. You know, where you are definitely seeing something. It's not, you know, there's no structure there. So I think it's either the physiological effects of radiation. It reflects what is exactly going on and it covers neutral territory. Yeah.
So
We have a
I was going to say there's already a well-defined term in physics called optical radiation, because that's the stuff you can move with lenses, propagate. So, and it covers this spectral range. So perhaps it's the physiological or human impact of optical radiation that we're looking at.
That's quite a mouthful.
Yes.
Does near infrared and far infrared respond to lenses?
Yeah.
One of that I have encountered, and I think this is interesting because I've spent a lot of time working with the Opsin researchers and asking them about this emerging near infrared evidence. And they were very hesitant to look at it because they said, where's the opsin? Show me the mechanism. Show me the molecular mechanism. But I have since become convinced after long talks with Robert Fosbury that the near infrared is working at a very different level, which makes sense given the scale of it. And it's working at the level of what I would call structural reception as opposed to molecular reception. So there's a very different biological response from the shorter wavelengths read through ultraviolet, which can drive a molecular opsin-based type response versus the longer wavelengths read through far infrared, which are interacting more like structural colors.
Yeah, they can. I think when you talk about the infrared and the near infrared, take opsin away. You know, just take opsin away. It's a bit harsh, but it's just not relevant because what is happening is the light is let's get good to say light. Let's say radiation. One word, radiation. Radiation is directly influencing cellular events, even if you take the eyes right out of it. And I very often don't. I wrap people's head in silver foil. I put people's heads in silver foil lined buckets. I look at effects that are completely independent of the eyes. I mean, it's the organism independent of the eyes. So I think opsins drags you back into the retina, drags you back into vision. And I think the effects that we're looking at in some areas bigger.
Not so much now that opsins are being found in other tissues, but the other term that is commonly used is photonic. And I think that does a better job of trying to capture the interactions between molecules and this radiative source. So if we start really paying attention to the characteristics of those photons and how they're interacting with tissue, we're doing a better job.
We have Jan Winold with his hands up in the audience as well. Jan, would you like to comment on the work?
Yeah, I think it's about another topic, but first of all, I want to thank you all the presenters. It was very inspiring and very widening the view. And I was, unfortunately, she's not here anymore. I was very happy to hear from Jennifer as president from CIE that daylight is now also a topic from CIE. I think we were fighting for this since, I don't know, 20 years. And it was never a big topic. So that was very good to hear. I just want to add something to Jennifer, and I will write her also, because the situation is actually not so bad as it turned out to be in terms of if you want to have daylight. And then it turned out, and the same happened in the CIE statement, that there is a conflict with glare, because actually there is an order of magnitude between this recommended level at the eye and when glare becomes really an issue in terms of intensity of light. And it's more an problematic. And the other good news is I've been working with shading industry for more than 20 years at Fraunhofer, and we had a lot of projects about controls. And actually the shading manufacturers, they know how to control the blinds pretty well, that the users would be satisfied. The core problematic is that these advanced controls are not bought. And they had it already. I don't know. We developed this in 2005, and they have controllers, cutoff control, double cutoff, and whatever. But the clients are not buying that. I don't know. This is less than 1% of the buildings that are equipped with this. And then what happens is that typical buildings get shading, of course, to prevent overheating, and then the shading is bad. And then people are annoyed by the controls. But basically, it's the lack of willingness to invest in the controls. And I think it's very important that we in future show this evidence. This was the last slide from Jennifer, that it's clear to show the evidence that, for example, with shadings, you can control the buildings pretty well in terms of energy and comfort. And just one last sentence of this conflict about this recommended level at the eye and glare. There will be a presentation of mine actually at the next CIE conference. A student of mine and me, we worked on that.
Thank you, Jan, for bringing back that topic. I think that also touches upon some of the topics that were mentioned in all the presentation in terms of how we realize everything in architecture, why is it, or in real life, or what are the main bottlenecks there. And public awareness was one of the things that Jennifer mentioned, and also Lisa, I think you mentioned this, that we need to sort of rethink how we design or re-engineer how we are thinking about. And I don't know, I mean, you mentioned that there is what we don't know why people are not buying these products, or why so one thing was the awareness, but then what are the other issues? Why can't we reach out and implement, and with these new findings related to what I would like to call lighting beyond visible or lighting biology, how can we make sure that we reach both in research and also in the real building design? What is the pathway? I think, yeah, Lisa, please.
Well, I spent a career doing energy research and doing cost-effective analysis of energy products, trying to solve the problem that Jan was bringing up, that people don't buy the stuff. How do we motivate them? How do we get that adopted into standard practice? And with regulations is kind of the punishment approach. But the biggest effect I have ever had was the research on daylighting and student performance, and showing that daylighting improved student performance had a transformational effect on the entire school design industry. Fundamentally, that is not a cost issue. That is something people value enormously. They want their children to be educated the best possible way. And if daylighting helps that, so be it. They will adopt daylighting into schools. Similarly, with health and wellness, I think that we really need to sidestep these cost effectiveness issues, because they change so radically with fluctuations in the economy. I was astonished when I went to Australia a few years back at the proliferation of operable shading devices used in their buildings. And there were so many systems, so many different flavors, so many different manufacturers, with a population the size of less than Southern California, right? It was more like the size of San Diego, how many people live in Australia. And yet that economy was able to support this proliferation of shading devices because they had a motivation to do so, and they had a culture that valued that for some reason. Whereas in California, with more than double the population of Australia, we can't get anything done. We've got a big, healthy economy. We've got lots of construction going on, and people still won't pay for operable systems. It's not a cost effectiveness equation. It's a value system. And I would say there's a similar problem that I've encountered with folks in the public health world, that they feel very devalued. They feel that their recommendations aren't followed. COVID certainly didn't help, but there's these sort of hierarchies within every professional group. And folks working in public health also feel that they are constantly struggling to get their message out, to get it paid attention to. What we really need is sort of this core connection to value, and certainly individual health is very high on the list. Corporate productivity is very high on the list. Student performance is very high on the list. Connecting with those things that people really, really care about is what drives development.
Thank you, Lisa. Jan, do you have your hand up as well, or is it from the?
No, it was at that, and basically I just want to add something because I wanted to say similar, but I think one thing to be added, because I'm always also a bit pessimistic. One thing that people really apply such things is really in regulations. So what we would need is basically, if we have a regulation saying we need so many hours per year at each workplace, so many hours of 250 lux by daylight, then automatically you can achieve this only without overheating, with appropriate window sizes and an operable shading device. So then we automatically would go there. So I think we need to show the positive side also to convince politicians or the decision makers, but that also bring this into standards and regulations, that basically the right to daylight, the right to have enough light at workplaces. I think both has to be done at the same time, and then things will happen. Yeah, it's why do we have in regulations that we have 20 degrees as a temperature in there, but not a certain amount of daylight? It's not in there, and if this is also in there, then it will be also considered, and it's not just nice to have; it's a must-have.
Well, Jennifer had an answer to that it's not demanded by the public. Peter, did you want to add something aligned to that?
Yes. If you want people to buy something out of their spare disposable income, you have to give them something which has an obvious and fairly quick benefit. So if you're concerned about glare, for instance, from windows, you can do something about that. If you want to know the effects of radiation on mitochondria, and they're not going to wait 30 years to find out. So what you need to be studying is something which would have an immediate benefit. It's a study, so it may take a few years. And my money would be on myopia. Now, if you could reduce the incidence of myopia and show that radiation exposure or something of that sort could limit that would be quite encouraging. So these businesses are looking at biological effects and so on. They're all very good, but I think the fundamental issues is one thing, but trying to find solutions to what what those issues expose is a rather, you have to be quite careful to make sure you can get demonstrate a benefit, and then it has more chance of being implemented.
I think that's really important. We've got a big temporal gap between a decision being made and the consequences of a wrong decision.
Yeah.
So, you know, you put people in, you pay for a bad environment, you put people in that bad environment, and you deal with the consequences 20 years later.
Yes.
We need to have a situation where if you've got bad lighting, you basically develop leprosy in 2 weeks. When we have something like that, then we get resolution. So I think this is really interesting. Moorfields is building a brand new hospital. The lighting is appalling, you know, and it's that gap. See, even with myopia, you know, myopia, a massive problem. A problem with an enormous cost in it for when these people reach 40, 45, they're going to develop a central form of macular degeneration.
Yeah.
But it's a long way down the road. You know, I agree with you. We need something that comes in quickly. And unless we do, we're not going to pay for it. People are not going to sit, there's going to be no perceived value.
Yes.
Well, Hillevi is on site dealing with those problems, I think. Do you think, did you?
I was just going to raise my hand, sorry. It was, I do agree with everyone that's been talking here previously as well. And I think that, as I also said, and as all the speakers said, that we do have an issue of what good lighting is. The people awareness, it is so low, and what can we do to actually increase the general public sort of knowledge about light and start teaching them to question the lighting. And I don't know if we should do more collaboration or just do more popular science or the conversation. I don't know if any one of you have actually written anything and submitted anything to the conversation, but it seems like almost half of the papers that are written on conversation, it is published in other journals as well. And I think that we might need to be better at also at communicating the essential issues regarding light and lighting and how it actually can affect us humans. And I think that it is essential with all these things that LED is dangerous. Why don't start there? Because we can actually say that LED might be hazardous and just write a paper about that. People will be aware of that because I think that we as researchers, we are so careful. We shouldn't say anything that might be wrong. And it is important that we don't say anything that might be wrong, but we also need to increase awareness. And with us being really careful, I think there's a huge crash here because how the media is today. We need to be more out there. We need to be more forthcoming with our results and even exaggerated to actually get through. That's what I think. And how can we do that in a good way to increase awareness? That's what I'm asking.
We have a question from the online audience. What are the low energy alternative to LED lighting that would be acceptable under current building regulations for architects to specify? Or are you aware of any new technologies being developed?
What's daylight?
Daylight.
Mirrors. Mirrors.
Daylight.
Yeah. Daylight. Daylight. Yeah. Yeah.
There are multiple drop LED technologies out there. So in principle, you can make an LED anywhere you like in the spectrum. You can populate other places. However, I think before we do that, we have a much bigger problem, is that we don't know the whole story yet. I'm someone now who's really glad I've retired, and this is all somebody else's problem.
Daylight is a really good buzzword here, and I think some whereas the ophthalmologists and Moorfields are just heading down the road to a brick wall, you do find people coming along saying, have you noticed that every A&E department lacks a window? A&E departments where you've got real physiological threat to people, you've got people who may die, are environments that are invariably badly lit with bright, harsh LEDs, and there's no windows.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for a quick effect, you know, a quick effect is, do you pull someone through the first 12 hours of a stroke? And we know stroke, I mean, I'm not banging on one particular drum, but the thing that will kill you with stroke is mitochondrial failure. Because when the blood supply to the brain goes, the next thing that's going to go is the mitochondria, and the mitochondria are going to signal death. So that's a little, and I think some of the A&E clinicians are slightly aware of it, because they get stressed because they work a 12-hour shift in an environment that's visually unpleasant.
Not to mention biologically dangerous.
Biologically dangerous, yeah.
We had an interesting discussion with Lisa the other day just about the fact that glazing industry also, when it comes to spectral selectivity, that, I mean, you presented it also today, Lisa, that is also a little bit limiting, because the focus has been on creating energy efficient glazing as well. And there is sort of a stop there, because at least, Lisa, you were telling me, because this industry is also exhausted by putting a lot of effort into creating low energy, reducing infrared, and it is taking a lot of effort for them also to kind of be on board with this. And I think we have to approach that industry as well, in terms of how much daylight and in which part of the spectrum should be coming in for the healthy glazing, because in that sense, we are also talking about this cost efficiency and energy performance, and that has been, I think, driven a lot of the what we have now, and Hillevi is dealing with the consequences. The rest of us are trying to understand how we can fix it meanwhile for the next 20 years. Yes, Lisa.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to appreciate just how long these kinds of changes take, how much investment the glazing industry has in developing these low energy systems. It's been a 50-year process, to the point where they are now so deeply invested in their infrastructure to produce these systems cost effectively, that making another right turn is, you know, a huge financial risk for them. And we also have such a huge investment in the energy efficiency infrastructure of codes and standards and research and policy development. It's going to take a while to make that ship take a turn. And we need to start laying groundwork in a number of ways. Yes, it would be wonderful to have some magic bullets that have a 10-day noticeable effect, but the reality is that daylight or lighting's impact on our physiology is subtle, and it's very long-term in terms of chronic diseases rather than sort of clinical diseases that show up quickly. So there needs to be a way to have a long-term strategy, then a midterm strategy, and we can have a short-term strategy too. But it's a very big effort that needs to be undertaken to get the ship to turn around.
Yeah. Is it the fact that we know that there are some impacts, but we don't know how they work together? Or is it the fact that we don't know what's out there that's the problem? I mean, I think
part of the problem is that many of the researchers know nothing about the other parts of the problem. And we are so siloed in terms of what we look at that people aren't talking to each other. I can tell you that the folks working on near infrared effects know very little about the ultraviolet effects, and vice versa. They're not talking to each other. Similarly, trying to get people involved in engineering or to think about biological impacts, that's not my lane. I don't need to think about that. I think about structures. I think about numbers and engineering. So I see this huge need for more integrative forums that bring different voices together, bring in public health, bring in energy policy, bring in manufacturing and structuring, and try to think through those problems together.
Yeah, I think I'm the only person that I know of in working in deep red light that walks into an architecture school. I mean, it gets me out of teaching because people don't know where I am, but at the same time, there's no interface, and this actually is a terribly important interface. There's a transition between shining red light in mouse eyes, which can be, really rewarding, or looking at lifespan in flies under different lighting conditions. But the ultimate translation is for these two areas to come together, but they haven't very well. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, can I just say something? There is a term that I don't know enough about. I don't really know much about it, but neuroarchitecture is a term that sort of floats around a bit, and that seems to be perhaps a bridge. Not, there are probably many bridges of joining up lots of this thinking, but that's a way of saying that architecture has an impact on our neurobiology. So I don't know if anybody knows it or can perhaps enlighten me about that.
Well, there's two initiatives to that effect. There's a group called ANFA, which is the Association for Neuroscience and Architecture, which is sort of a loose association of academics, mostly architects, very few neurologists involved. And then there's also sort of a spin-off group from that called Moving Boundaries, which is trying to bring together more of this public health physiological research into architectural design. That group has been going around the world leading week-long workshops and trying to bring folks together. The Daylight Academy also is a forum that is very multidisciplinary, and from my point of view, has actually been the most successful at prompting those kinds of cross conversations. So there are some nascent efforts, but I think we need a lot more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point. We need a lot more. I myself, having mainly graduated in terms of lighting and daylighting, now I'm teaching a module on health and well-being, where I'm looking at thermal comfort, air quality, acoustics, and lighting. And the idea is to open up this conversation within the engineering between these set of professions. And it is not easy, but I think this is sort of a perhaps also way to be able to start these conversations between the disciplines and between the domains, research-wise and also discipline-wise, educationally. So yeah, so it seems that we all have a lot to do. I guess I just at the end feel like now a bit more stressed that we are not doing enough. Feel that I need to go home.
No, you're supposed to feel energized, motivated.
Well, I guess you need that stress too.
Have we had enough daylight to energize?
Yeah, I mean, of course, probably that's a more positive way of looking at it. I feel more energized that I need to do a lot more, and what we are doing is definitely needed. And I guess that brings us also to the last minute of this webinar. So thank you so much for presenting. I wonder if anybody has a last message or a question that they want to pose.
Get different people in the room.
Get different people in the room.
Bob Fosbury walked into my lab and he was an astronomer. He didn't know anything about the eye. And within a year, I found out about what light, I found out something about light. And as a visual scientist, I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. So get different people in the room. Even when I'm talking to my son, who's got nothing to do with science whatsoever, and I say I'm doing this, that, and the other, the challenge is fantastic. Why? You know, what's the reason? And different people in the room are incredibly important.
Yeah, perfect. Takeaway message, get different people in the room. Thank you all. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
so much for your time.